This is not a podcast about being broken, although you may have been. This is a podcast about strength for women who find themselves in difficult relationships, including that sometimes difficult one with yourself. We'll look at your relationship through a lens of psychology, faith, and a little dash of my own kind of feminism. We're not fixing them, we're fixing you, and that changes everything. Welcome to Stronger in the Difficult Places. Save yourself, heal your relationships. Listen in. Hello, it's Dr. Zoe. I'm so glad you're tuning in today. We're talking about recovering from purity culture. And for some of you who didn't grow up in the purity culture, might be like, well, what are you talking about and what's the big deal? And then for others, you may feel like we're pushing up against some of your beliefs. And just for clarification, my goal is not to debate what's right or what's wrong, but really just to invite you to be open. Because what I do know is that for some subset of people, purity culture has had a massive effect on their relationships. And so I think this is a worthy topic to explore. And so I invited Dr. Camden Morgante on to talk about recovering from purity culture. Dr. Camden is a licensed psychologist, coach, speaker, and author of Recovering from Purity Culture. But before we get started, as usual, I'm going to share my wins and my fails with you and remind you that I do this because I want you to take some time every week to reflect on your wins and your fails. Acknowledging your wins are basically positive affirmations for yourself, just reminding yourself, hey, I did a good job, and that's good. And acknowledging your failures reminds you that your failures are lessons. And you can see them as such instead of wasting your emotional health on making yourself feel bad about your failures. We're human and they happen, and I share mine so that you can remind yourself to honor yours. So, okay, what's up with me? Okay, this is a silly win, but hey, it's life. I'm sharing it. I had the craziest thing happen to me. I get up in the morning and I walk and or run 3 miles every day. And on one of my walks, I was on the phone because I also multitask. And so I'm usually talking or listening to a book while I'm walking. And at this point, I was talking to my sister on the phone. And all of a sudden, I felt this sharp pain at the bottom of my ankle. And I looked down and this little tiny dog, I don't know, maybe 10 pounds, bit my ankle. And I jumped, screamed. And when my feet hit the ground, I guess I hit the ground so hard, it jarred my body and dislodged my Apple AirPod from my ear. It fell on the ground, and this dog looked at me, looked at my AirPod, and I kid you not, this dog picked up my AirPod and started running. So then I'm chasing this dog down the street because it's got my AirPod, and you guys know these things are not cheap, and I lose them on the regular, but this was not the way I wanted to lose my AirPod this week. And so I'm chasing this dog down the street. It has the AirPod in its mouth, and I get it all the way to its gate, I guess where it lived, and there was like a hole in the gate. And that dog stopped, looked at me. I'm yelling at the dog, by the way, and chasing it, looking like a crazy woman. This dog looked at me, dropped the AirPod, and went through that little hole in the gate, and then stood on the other side of the gate looking at me like, what are you going to do to me now? So why is that my win? It's my win because I got my AirPod back, put it directly back in my ear. And my friend was like, ew, you put it in your ear right after that? I'm like, sure did. But then I went home and disinfected it after that because, I was reminded that maybe that was gross. But it's my win because that dog did not get my AirPod. I chased that dog down the street, got a sprint workout in at the same time, and got my AirPod back. And truth is stranger than fiction. That's it. So my fail. Okay, I have been a therapist for over a couple of decades, 23, 24 years. It's been a while, y'all. And I have been working remotely for maybe, 7, 8 years, maybe 10 years. But I still struggle with time zones. I get myself messed up with time zones. Does anybody else have that problem? I schedule in my calendar. I think I'm scheduling right. I always count whether it's 3 hours if you guys are on the East Coast, if we're, mid or near here, it's 2 hours central, right? 1 hour mountain. I think that's right. But inevitably, I make a mistake. And I did that this week. I messed up on a client. It's so very frustrating. And so my fail is, despite me double checking and double counting. Sometimes I mess up on my calendar and I get the wrong time in, and it's frustrating. And maybe the lesson for me is that I need to stop expecting myself to not make those mistakes and just get rid of human error and let my clients all schedule in the scheduling app. Okay, once again, on to more important topics. Listen in to my interview with Dr. Camden Morgante on recovering from purity culture. Dr. Camden, I'm so excited to have you here today. And I know I say that all the time, and I know I also give a disclaimer, but I found you on Instagram because of, I think it was actually Threads. There was some type of post you put up that just really resonated with me. And I thought, I want to find out more about her. And I looked you up and I asked you on the podcast. And now we've been talking, and there's so many connections that we have. So I'm thrilled to have you on, and I'm thrilled that you're willing to talk about a difficult topic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I'm so glad we connected. We have so much in common. So this is exciting.
Yeah, we do. So, I've talked a little bit about purity culture. I don't know that I've talked about it that much, but it's something that has affected me for sure in my life, and we can talk about that. But I want to know a little bit about your background and your history with purity culture and what made you start diving into this.
Yeah, I grew up evangelical Christian and pretty conservative and went to Christian college and grad school and had great experiences overall and pretty positive church experiences overall. And but was just really steeped in purity culture. I had a True Love Waits ring and made a pledge. True Love Waits
Hold on,
pledge.
I think we need to define this stuff because people might be going,
Okay.
wait, what's purity culture? What's True Love Waits? What's a pledge?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. The True Love Waits ring and pledge was you're pledging to not have sex before marriage. You're pledging to be abstinent until you get married. And purity culture is the name of the culture that grew up around this belief that Christians should save sex for marriage. But it's called a culture because it's more than just that belief that defines it. It's all of the cultural artifacts like the rings. They had rallies. They had pledges. They had balls, even like dances with father-daughter where you would pledge your virginity to your father until you got married, which is kind of creepy. And it just fostered this whole culture and these myths that I now call them around the idea of purity. So I really bought into that, was, very, very much on board with that ideology. And then I found that the promises of purity culture were false. They didn't come true for me. That I dated someone in college and I thought I was going to marry him. We were in a ring by spring school, which is a Christian school where it's very common to get married while you're in school, very young, very quick. And we did everything right as far as maintaining abstinence and things like that. And then we broke up and I was just heartbroken and devastated. And it really affected my faith too. It really shook my faith because I was like, I've done everything right. Like, where is this promised reward that I was told I was going to get because I stayed pure? So it made me doubt God's goodness. And it kind of just started me on this journey of questioning my faith and kind of wrestling with some of my beliefs and I kind of went through that in grad school. And then several years later, I finally met my husband and got married and just realized, purity culture really, really wasn't true for anyone. It just it didn't play out the way that they told us. And it's had a lot of unintended consequences that I was seeing in my clients, especially sexual shame, sexual problems, the problems in faith like I had. And so then I started researching it and writing about it. Wrote my first article about it in like 2018, 19, and then started on this journey of trying to write a book that's coming out this year. So,
yes, you wrote a book that's coming out this year. Yes, which I'm very excited to read. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your journey. I've had a different journey with purity culture. I also grew up in fundamental Christian home. And during that time in the 80s and 90s of, the purity culture. And for me, I had a very different experience where for me, the unintended consequence of the purity culture was the shame because I did not feel able to live up to that expectation. And yet I held it so strongly. And I ended up having a teenage pregnancy. I placed my daughter for adoption and I had just a really decades of shame spiral. spiraling regarding that. And which is why when I started reading some of your material, it just really piqued my interest, because I know that I am not the only one, and you are not the only one who have had some some of those unintended consequences of the purity culture. And like you said, the concept, the idea, of course, is good. And maybe we'll talk about that. But it's the practice that has been very shaming. And like you said, making hollow promises, and specifically directed towards women. So let's dive into what some of those tenets are. And then even more, what are those unintended consequences that some women might be experiencing and not even realize that they have experienced it?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I started my research, I kind of distilled purity culture teachings down into these 5 myths, and then looked at how each of those are false, and then what the harm or unintended consequences of those were. So the first myth is, I call the spiritual barometer myth, where your spirituality can be measured by your sexual abstinence or purity. And the consequences of that for me were a lot of ugly pride, like sinful pride, of where I felt like I was better than other people, or I judged other people. A lot of judgmentalism came from that. And what I call like the idolatry of virginity, like it was just held up as this idol. Instead of rooting our identity and our purpose in our relationship with Christ, it was rooted in virginity. And so that was the harm of that myth. And then the next one was the fairy tale myth, that if you stay pure, you'll have a fairy tale marriage and family. And that's the one that affected me the most, when I found that didn't come true, and I was just devastated. Pouring everything into that relationship, and just really thinking I'm going to get the fantasy of, here's my first love, and it's going to, my first kiss, even, that was going to be my husband. And seeing everybody around me get married before me. I didn't get married till I was almost 30, which in the South, in Christian circles, is really old. Like when I say that to other people, they're like, that's kind of average, or that's, and I'm like, it's actually, kind of old for the region that I'm in, and just the culture that the Christian culture I'm from. So,
also because the culture pushes you to get married early, which is another unintended, I think, negative consequence, is that it pushes both men and women to make these choices very, very early in their life in order to prevent premarital sex, right? You're making a choice to be with someone for the rest of your life who may not be a good fit for you. And then, of course, once you've gotten married, then you absolutely can't get divorced. And all of that is because of this wanting to prevent this, premarital sex from happening.
Yes. And I interviewed some women who were divorced, widowed, or single, never married, and older than they, wanted to be, for my book, because I wanted some more of those perspectives. And all of the women I interviewed who were divorced all got married at like age 20 to their first love. And it didn't last very long. Some of them had just lasted 5 years or so. Some of them had children, from that marriage, and then got divorced. Many of those marriages were abusive, or at least infidelity was taking place. Like it was just really hard hearing those stories where the women were like, I was 20. I didn't even really know who I was, much less who he was, and what I needed, and if we were compatible or not. And certainly that's not everyone's story. Like we all know the couple that got married when they were 20 and been together 50 years or whatever. But
it was my parents. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's sweet. And certainly God can bless them. But yeah, for a lot of people, they were told to get married young to be pure, so that they didn't have premarital sex. And it's like, that's not a good enough reason to marry somebody who you're not compatible with, or who's not a healthy partner for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So I interrupted you. So you're saying that the first tenet.
So those were the first 2 myths. The third myth, I call the flip switch myth, where once you get married, you just flip a switch and sex is automatically going to be great. And there are so many quotes in purity culture books that I quoted in my book that actually promise this. If you wait, sex will be great. It will be a blast. God will bless you. Like they say that. And so why wouldn't we believe it? And then the truth is, I work with so many couples now who've been married 20 years and they've never really enjoyed sex. We're still working, decades after their true love waits pledge, we are working on their sexual shame and their lack of sexual pleasure, or their low sex drive. That all really comes from purity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know shame drives a lot of that, right? A lot of the sexual issues that we have are psychological issues. And what is hard to, like you said, flip off is this concept of sex is shameful, sex is bad. And then we flip the switch, and tomorrow, now because you have a ring and you said some words in front of, God, now sex is good and sex is wonderful and you should enjoy it. When you've already had this whole psychological shame burden attached to sex. Yeah.
Well, I'm finding with many of the women that I work with that they have repressed their sexuality for so long in order to try to stay abstinent.
Yes.
That continues into marriage. Like, they have a hard time seeing themselves as a sexual person. They have a hard time celebrating their sexuality as something that's good to express in their marriage. It still feels dirty and wrong and sinful, or just like, that's not me. I'm not that way, versus being able to celebrate that that's a part of them that they can now express. So yeah, a lot of low sex drives comes from that. It's not because there's something physically wrong with them.
Mm-hmm. And I see that. I have seen that a lot in my work with couples as well, especially couples in the church, and especially for me, young couples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fourth myth is damaged goods myth. And so that's the most damaging one in my opinion, or in my experience, where people who do have premarital sex, or even women who are sexually abused, feel like they're damaged goods and they're no good anymore. And that God can't possibly bless them or give them a good marriage. And there were so many object lessons used in purity culture, where an object like a rose was taken and petals torn off of it to represent, these pieces of yourself that you're giving away when you have sex. And that's just so damaging, because those images really stay with us, those symbols. In fact, I've got the one copy of my book that I have here, and we did the two roses on the cover, and one is like dead and dying, and one representing healing and growth, because I wanted to capture that imagery and kind of turn it on its head to show, like, you're not that damaged rose. You're there's a possibility of that healing and hope for you.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting, because, I do a lot of shame work and differentiate shame from guilt.
Yes.
And when we look at that concept, especially, I've seen it with the rose. I've seen it with like pouring dirty water in a pure cup, and that does create shame. And the difference is, with guilt, if we just talk about a behavior that maybe that's not healthy for you, that maybe you don't want to continue, that could be inciting guilt. And with guilt, we can do something about it. We can change the behavior, right? Alleviate the issue. We can choose to be different. But when you say damaged goods, or when you insinuate, because maybe those words aren't necessarily said, but when you insinuate damaged goods, then that creates shame, which is a sense of I am bad. And there's nothing you can do from that except for hide, right? Or really just hide. I mean, you can try to run, but you can't run from yourself. And that's where I see a lot of that shame is I am bad. And now that this thing has happened, there's nothing I can do to fix it. Like you said, I am damaged now, goods. And so I love that you are turning that on its head and speaking to women and letting them know, no, actually, you're not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly how I teach it too, like with shame and guilt. And really, that guilt can be a healthy emotion, and we can have a healthy response to it. So I'm trying to help people figure out, is this shame from purity culture, or is this healthy guilt that's showing you when your actions aren't aligned with your values? And so in my book and in my work, like, I really take care not to prescribe what people should believe about sex, or what they should do, and what their sexual ethic should be, but help them, give them tools to figure out what their sexual ethic is based on their own values and their own theology. And I'm not a theologian, so I kind of try to stay in my lane as a psychologist and give people more so like questions and tools to explore those questions for themselves. But I think what I see in a lot of my clients is sometimes there is that healthy guilt because they are going against their own values. And often the world's offer of, it's all about consent. That's right. All you need is consent and sex, and then it's fine. Like, my clients find that, that's really not fulfilling to them, or that really doesn't feel healthy to them or aligned with their values. They need more than that. Even if they don't still hold to that traditional sexual ethic, consent is still not enough. So that's a big argument I make in the book.
Okay. Okay. And so as I'm thinking about women who may be listening to this, and most of my clientele are, I mean, they're not in their teens and their 20s, right? They're
Yeah.
in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And so they may be in a space of being in a marriage and a relationship right now and recognizing, oh, I realized that I had some of those unintended consequences of the purity culture, and I'm seeing its effects in my life today. How do you speak to those women who are in marriages and, in this space of recognizing um, how it affected them,
Hmm.
quite
You
knowing
know,
what to do with it?
I think first recognizing the effects is the first step, and being able to deconstruct some of those beliefs that you had that could still be hanging around even decades later. Are you still believing that sex is only for men and it's all to meet your husband's sexual needs, which I call the gatekeeper's myth, that women are the gatekeepers of sexuality? Or are you still believing that it should just be easy because you waited and you're experiencing so much disappointment about that and grief about that? So recognizing the effects, being able to deconstruct the beliefs and separate what is biblical and what is aligned with my beliefs and values, and then what was cultural. There's nothing in the Bible that says sex is just for men. In fact, it says the opposite, that sex should be mutual and for both, for the pleasure and intimacy of both partners. So yeah, so I think being able to deconstruct it and really replace it with truth is the key to getting, the head part, the mind part. But then the next tricky part is getting your body aligned with that. So my clients will sometimes say, like, I know what the truth is, but yet I don't feel it.
Yeah.
Like there's a disconnect between mind and body. And so a lot of my coaching work and then some of the tools that I offer in the book are about that mind body integration and how to take the new truth and the knowledge from your head and live it out in your embodied experience.
That's so good. That's so good because, yeah, sometimes we know things logically, but the way that we learn things is not necessarily through logic. We learn through emotion, and
Yeah.
emotion gets into our mind, and it really does seep into our body. And we develop this kind of muscle memory, and it's harder to convince our body of things, even though logically we might know something. So that's really good that you give some of those physiological mind body connections for people. When you were talking about men being the gatekeeper, I've definitely seen this. I'm sorry, about women
Yeah.
being the gatekeeper. I've definitely seen this. And some women, I was talking to somebody and I don't remember who, but she was talking about essentially feeling like she had to make sure that she prevented her husband from being exposed to any kind of, I don't know, pornography or tempting things online or something. And I was my heart was just so saddened to hear that, because this concept of it's her responsibility to keep her husband straight and narrow, as opposed to him having any of his own responsibility for that, right? And I think that's also one of the unintended consequences of the purity culture, because what happens is if for some reason your spouse is not, then the opposite that means, if we go along with that logic, somehow it's your fault. It's your fault that he wasn't able to stay faithful, or that he strayed, or whatever the case, or even that, maybe way back that you guys had sex. And so I know a lot of women feel that sense of pressure or burden to be that gatekeeper of, their husband's purity.
Exactly. And you can see how that would lead to shame too. Then if their husband is unfaithful or looks at porn or something like that. Well, I must not have been giving him enough sex, or I must not have been sexy enough, or I did something wrong in some way. And sometimes men will even blame their wives in
Absolutely.
an overt way. But even if it doesn't lead to that, a way that I see that message showing up is women still can't get over the role of having to gatekeep boundaries. They're still kind of like stuck in their head instead of being able to inhabit their bodies during sex. And so when women say, like, I just don't feel a lot of pleasure, I don't have orgasms, like often it's because they're so stuck in their heads and they're still like, thinking about even, sexual boundaries. Like, Is this okay if he touches me here? Or, should I stop this? Or, ooh, is this comfortable for me? Am I a sexual person like this? I don't know. There's just a lot going on still in their head that keeps them from really fully enjoying and embodying during sex.
What's your suggestion for a woman who recognizes herself in what you just said?
Yeah, mindfulness practice. I teach a lot of mindfulness skills and using that in sexuality then. So once you kind of learn those mindfulness skills and build up your mindfulness muscle in everyday life, then translating that into sensual encounters so that you're fully experiencing your five senses. You're able to stay in your body instead of dissociating or, just being stuck in racing thoughts. And meditating on like the sacredness of sex too, for people whose like theology aligns with that, of just that this is something sacred and spiritual and something that is celebrated in a healthy marriage. And so we'll kind of look at that too and help them kind of reframe their view of sex from something that's dirty and sinful to this is something that I can celebrate.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm wondering, how can we bring our partners into this? Because as you were saying, we know that the purity culture has been so damaging to women, but if it's been damaging to women, it must also then be damaging to men because we are half of the equation, right? In partnership. And so men are also experiencing this, maybe unknown, but they are. And so I wonder, do you talk in your book about bringing men into this equation in these conversations?
Yeah. In my work, I work with either women individually or married couples together. And so that does involve looking at how it's affected him. And sometimes men are less, they're more reluctant to admit that.
Yeah.
And there's been less research and less conversation about that. But I do recommend the book Non-Toxic Masculinity, which is all about purity culture's effects on men. The author, Zachary Wagner, says purity culture dehumanized women's bodies, but it dehumanized men's minds. Yeah, that their minds are debased and just, out of control and lustful and things like that. So I will recommend that book a lot to the men and the couples that I work with, and looking at like, what are the messages that you took in, even unintentionally, unconsciously, because often there's some sexual entitlement that they're not always fully aware of, or maybe they've started to deconstruct, and they really have to kind of repair with that with their wife and put more of a focus on her and her pleasure and her experience too. So it's a very holistic approach. We talk about things like, are you taking on an equal mental load or household responsibilities? Like something like that you would think that doesn't have anything to do with our sex life, but it really can make a big impact. So we'll talk about that to expanding the definition of intimacy too. That's a big thing with men, is that sex equals intimacy. If I want closeness or if I want to feel connected to my partner, which is a basic human need to feel that attachment, then I have to have sex. And so then they start to equate sex with a need when it's actually not a need. The attachment and connection is. So we talk about what are some other ways you can get that need for closeness and connection met, and that you're maybe discounting. They discount, oh yeah, she gives me words of affirmation, or we spend time together, or she does things for me, or, but they don't really take that in as, oh, this is a form of closeness and love. It's not just when she has sex with me.
Right. That's good. That's good. There's actually been studies that men who do more laundry have more sex.
Yeah. Chore play is what the literature calls it.
Chore play. Okay.
Chore play. Yeah. Yeah. But it's just because so many women are just constantly tired, especially in the stage of life where we're raising young kids or maybe working too, or just taking care of the house. So anything you can do to have that be more mutual and equal, I think can help enhance the mutuality in your sex life too.
Wow. So good. So good. So for a woman who is listening to this and maybe already knew that she had some negative sexual messages from her childhood and is recognizing that, maybe that's still influencing me, what would you say for her is a first step in trying to address this?
Yeah, I think, like we said, that first step of recognizing it and giving yourself grace, that there's nothing wrong with you, which is that shame. Like there's nothing wrong with you or broken or damaged about you, that you're still struggling in these areas, or that you still have body image shame or sexual shame decades into marriage. This is really common. This is all the coaching work that I do. And in fact, I had one client say, I realize I'm not weird because you've made a whole career out of this, like I basically, she's not the only one. And yeah, I hear these stories so much. And that's really what drove me to I want to make this information and these tools more accessible so that people who can't afford working with a therapist or a qualified coach, so that they can have access to these tools and do some self-help for themselves, to start to heal that mind body divide, and also pay attention to the heart and soul, like all four of those, getting them aligned, so that you live more integrated and with more wholeness.
That's beautiful. And so what can we do as women? Because, I've got teenage daughters. And
oh, do you?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Well, I've got an 11-year-old and I've got an 18-year-old. So, and so, this is definitely something that I've been thinking about in terms of what I learned and what I was taught about my sexuality. So for women and moms out there who have teenagers, who have daughters and sons, and don't want to inflict the same type of, shame or the same type of messaging that they got, what's the answer? Because here's what I know is that we tend to swing the pendulum, right? So, we got this experience, and so then we swing the pendulum in the complete opposite direction, attempting not to create that same experience. And often we just, I think either sides of the pendulum are often unhealthy. And so the question is, how do we come back to the middle? What kinds of things do we want to be focusing on as we're talking to our children about their sexuality?
Yeah, I agree with you about the pendulum. And that's why I said, people swing from the purity culture, which I call a sexual ethic of shame, to that ethic of just consent.
Yeah.
And ignore some, there's values. There's a lot in between to consider. And so same with parenting. I'll have clients say, I don't want my daughter to have the sexual shame that I had, but I also don't want her to just give into hookup culture. So I think it starts younger than teenagers. I have little kids. And so I offer a lot of suggestions in my book about starting when they're young, with talking about their bodies in shame-free ways and modeling consent as you touch them and interact with them, helping them see that their bodies are good, and, using the correct anatomical names, things like that.
Yeah.
I think as they get older, you're infusing your family's values into those conversations. Yes, talk about consent. But what's the value behind that is respect for self and others. That I respect my body and I respect you and your body and your autonomy. And so that goes both ways with consent, of giving and asking for consent. But also, how does that translate to other sexual choices you might make, of how you want to treat your body and others' bodies? And critical thinking, that's another value that I hold for my family. I want my kids to not just take things, we were just told because the Bible says so, or because I told you so. I want them to actually critically think about, well, what does the Bible actually say and why? And really understand that. So I would say dig deeper on what are the values that your family holds that you really want to instill in your kids, and see how you can infuse those values into the conversations about sexuality.
I think that's an excellent point, especially understanding the why, because I think so many parents try to teach their children what to believe without giving them any kind of basis as to why. What's the reasoning behind it? And when that happens, I feel like that belief is shallow. It's a shallow belief, and it's not attached to anything, deep that will hold long, and also that I guess just that makes sense. And so it's so important to not just talk to our children about what we believe, but why we believe, and to ask them questions. We learn, and I think we help our children so much when we ask them questions rather than telling them what to believe, because then we can have really good conversations when we've actually asked them, what do you think? What's your experience been? What do you see? A lot of parents are fearful of doing that because they're worried that their children are going to have different or, opposite opinions. And when we can let go of that fear and recognize that their opinions are theirs, whether they express them or not. And so it's more helpful if we know what they are and can have those conversations than to try to just force feed our own will on them.
Yeah, and I think that works for a lot of issues. Like modesty is a big part of purity culture. And sometimes people will say, like, well, how do I teach modesty without shame? It's like, but what's the why behind modesty? That's really what it comes down to is, I have little kids, but when they get older, if my daughter wants to wear something that I feel like is, inappropriate, she's going to say, but why is this inappropriate? And then that gives us a chance to talk about life skills like looking at the context or the environment of where we are and the people who are there and what's appropriate to the occasion and the weather and like some of those types of things instead of just, well, because older men will look at you or because you'll look like a, derogatory term. Like just instead of resorting to those, we actually get to dig deeper into those life skills and help her think through what's appropriate to wear and also why she wants to wear it. Like, I'll be curious, like, is it just because all your friends are? Because that's not aligned with our family's values. We don't do things just because everybody else is, like we do things because it's right for us and it goes with our beliefs. So I think, there's a lot of questions to consider there and to ask them and help them explore.
Wow. Thank you for such a rich conversation. I think we need to talk about this more. And I'm so glad that your book is coming out. I will be consuming it. So I'm very thankful for that. Is there any last thing that you would like to tell a woman who is just listening today and maybe is curious or feels like she's been there?
Yeah, I guess just that the shame doesn't belong to you, that you can shed the shame, leave it behind and walk forward in faith and freedom, knowing that you're not damaged goods and your identity is not determined by what's been done to you or what you've done in the past or who you are now sexually and what your sex life is like. Your identity is fully in yourself and in your relationship with God and move forward in that. And so I just want people to be set free from the shame that comes along with purity culture. And so with that, I'd like to hear, just more about your research with complex shame and how do you see that interacting with this topic as we're talking about it?
Oh, that's so good. Because, what I found about complex shame is that it tends to develop pretty early and probably comes from our family of origin, those voices and words and messages. And then we have these shaming incidents, right? And so as I think about purity culture, I think about the shaming incidents that can happen with purity culture, whether it's just developing a body shame, right? When we talk about that responsibility, or whether you have done something that goes against what you've been taught, and then you develop this deep sense of shame. And, the thing with complex shame that is different than what I call basic or simple shame and toxic shame. With simple shame, you're able to talk about it and you receive empathy and you feel a sense of release. You're vulnerable, you receive empathy, you feel a sense of release from the shame. Okay. With complex shame, you don't get that sense of relief. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is because when someone says, oh, I get it, or I understand, or it wasn't your fault, there's a sense that you have of, but you don't understand. Right. And there's a couple of things that you may feel you don't understand. One of the things is that what we do with shame sometimes, especially complex shame, is that we have a shaming incident and then we hurt ourselves. So, and in an attempt to kind of hide the shame or get rid of the shame or deal with the shame, compensate with the shame. And so we hurt ourselves in different ways. I mean, there's so many different kinds of ways. We may continue to act out in the shameful way. We may, develop relationships that are self-harming. We may self-harm ourselves. We may develop addiction. So many things that get very wrapped up and complicated with the shame. And so it's not just one thing that we're feeling shameful about. It's a whole conglomeration of things and who we are. It's kind of like that snowball, right? That rolls down the hill. And so when we try to express ourselves and get that sense of empathy from other people, it does nothing. And so our shame just continues. The other method that I think complex shame continues and a way to kind of identify it is that we get gaslighted when we do try to be empathic about our shame or seek empathy, where people will tell you, well, no, that's not really what happened with your shame. So sometimes this is trauma related, or for underserved communities or minorities, you might express something that happened and you're just gaslighted about the experience. All it does is make the shame go deeper. There's a certain personality type too that I've recognized is more susceptible to complex shame. And that is what I call the internalizer, right? So we know like there's internalizers and externalizers. People who have receive a lot of trauma or shaming incidents when they're young, and their externalizers tend to move towards maybe personality disorders. Right? And so they are the toxic people. They push all of their shame out on other people. But then there's the internalizers, and those internalizers take it all in themselves. And what they do is they tend to be the ones that are the codependents in the codependent relationships. And they just really hurt themselves as a result of their shame. The good news, I think, for those internalizers, though, is that there is hope for your shame. I think when your shame becomes toxic, we know with personality disorders and things like that, there's less hope in terms of healing. And so I know that because of the way that the purity culture drives the sense of shame into you, that women coming out of it tend to have that complex type shame. And so part of the solution, I believe, is to, number one, be able to identify it and what I call untangle it, because your shame becomes very much attached to your personality. And yes, those steps of speaking it, being vulnerable, receiving empathy are steps towards untangling it. But the biggest one is learning how to forgive yourself. And that sometimes includes forgiving yourself for something you never did, which is a little twist, because our brain feels that we are at fault because we've been taught we're at fault, right? And so when someone says, oh, it's not your fault, your response is, but you don't really understand. And so what we have to do is allow ourselves, and it might sound like victim blaming, but it's not. We have to kind of work with our brain and forgive ourselves for things that we never did. And then all the things that we did do to run from it or allow someone to do to us. And in that forgiving process, we're able to learn to let go of that shame. That was long-winded, but
wow. Yeah. So you said basic shame, complex shame. Did you mention toxic shame too? Is that something different or?
Yeah. So complex shame and toxic shame are different. One is that people with toxic shame tends to externalize, right? And people with toxic shame, their shame is more, it's like a stronger shame. It's more attached to personality, which is harder to separate. I don't really talk about that or work with personality disordered people. So that's not really the area that I'm talking about. I'm talking about that middle ground where it's not simple shame. It's complex, but it's curable.
Okay. That's so interesting. Yeah. Cause I was just thinking about how that applies to purity culture. Like when I said, when I got married when I was 30, and some people are like, that's normal, and so if I had shame about that. And so people were like, oh, that's normal. There's nothing wrong with that. Like that would do nothing for my shame, because it's like, but you don't understand the context I came from and the beliefs I grew up with.
Yeah.
But when people would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense given your context, given your, your upbringing, that would heal more of that shame. Is that what you mean about? Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. That's the gaslighting portion that some people with complex shame experience, where people are just kind of denying your experience when you know that you feel it and that it's real.
Yeah. And I can totally see how that would happen more for people from more marginalized communities where they experience discrimination or like the microaggressions and things like that. People kind of brush it off. And yeah, I can see that. Well, thanks for explaining all that to me.
You're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome. I love talking about shame, and I love that you've identified it within the context of purity culture.
Yeah, because everybody that comes out of purity culture, I think, has shame.
100%. Yeah.
I call it the universal experience of purity culture, because whether you stayed a virgin or not, whether you're male or female, married or single, like it really seems to affect everybody in one way or another. We all had different experiences, but we all experienced some sort of shame, and even to the point of trauma. Like a lot of my clients have those symptoms of complex trauma, like because purity culture was like a series of little T traumas for many of us. So, and then for some people, big T traumas as well. So, yeah. So it's a long process to unravel or untangle, as you said.
Yeah, it is. And thank you for helping people start that process of untangling it.
Yeah, thank you.
So how can people find you and find your
yes. Yes. You can find my website, and I'm on all the social medias as Dr. Camden, Dr. Camden. So, and you can find my book, Recovering from Purity Culture, wherever books are sold. It's available for pre-order now and comes out October 15th. So, yeah.
That is exciting. Well, I will definitely be reading it. Thank you for being willing to write on this topic.
Yes, thank you. It's a long process to write a book, as you know.
It is. I definitely know. Thank you so much, Dr. Camden. Thank you for listening to Stronger in the Difficult Places. New episodes go up on Tuesdays. Subscribe to my email list so that you can get some encouragement from me. Have a strong week.